The letter arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, the whole town of Bitter Ridge knew what Silas Crowley had done. He'd stood in the middle of Hargrove's feed store, didn't even bother lowering his voice, and told every man within earshot that Ethan Mercer's new bride was a joke the catalog played on a desperate fool. He laughed first. The others followed, and then he added something that made even the kinder men go quiet. Send her back on the next train. A woman like that won't last a Wyoming winter. She'll break before the first frost, just like everything else Mercer touches. Ethan was standing outside. He heard every word. He didn't go in. He just stood there in the dust with his hat in his hands, and something in his chest collapsed like a rotten floorboard finally giving way. Because the worst part wasn't that Crowley said it. The worst part was that Ethan wasn't sure the man was wrong. If you've ever been counted out by someone who never gave you a fair chance, if you've ever watched a bully smile while he twisted the knife, then stay with me. Because what happened next on that dying Wyoming homestead is the kind of story they don't put in history books. They should have. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you the way it moves me, hit that like button. Now let's go back to 1884 and meet the woman Silas Crowley made the mistake of underestimating. The morning the train was due, Ethan Mercer woke up before the sun and lay on his back staring at the ceiling for a long time. The ceiling needed work. There was a water stain shaped like the state of Ohio spreading from the corner above the window, and two of the boards had warped so badly that a man could see pale gray sky through the gap when the light hit it right. He'd been meaning to fix it for 2 years. He hadn't fixed it. That pretty much described the last 2 years of his life in total. He was 31 years old, and he felt 50. Ethan got up without making breakfast because there wasn't much left to make. He fed the 4 remaining chickens. He'd had 16 chickens 8 months ago, which told you something right there. And he stood in the yard of his homestead and looked at what remained of what his father had built and what he had mostly destroyed through bad luck and worse decisions. The main cabin stood solid enough. His father had built it right, using good timber, back when timber was still something a man could afford to haul out here. But the barn listed to one side like a tired horse. The fence line along the east pasture had 3 sections that were more suggestion than barrier, and the small outbuilding where he stored feed and tools had a roof that had partially collapsed sometime last January. He'd tacked a canvas over it. The canvas was rotting now. There were 11 cattle left on 300 acres that used to carry 60 head. He owed the Cattlemen's Bank of Cheyenne $430 in back interest on a loan that his father had taken and Ethan had inherited along with everything else. He had $82 in a tin box under the floorboard near the stove. He'd counted it 3 times in the last week, as though the number might change. The train from Laramie arrived in Bitter Ridge at 11:10 in the morning on most days, and today was the day his mail-order bride was supposed to step off it. He'd written to the Western Correspondence Bureau 6 weeks ago out of something closer to desperation than hope. The Bureau had sent back a letter written in a woman's careful hand introducing herself as Helena Barrett, 34 years of age, capable, experienced in domestic matters, and willing to relocate to Wyoming. She had included a small photograph, which was blurry in the way that photographs from catalogs always seem to be, as though the camera couldn't quite commit to a clear opinion about the subject. Ethan had studied that photograph for a long time. He had told himself he wasn't a shallow man. He had also told himself that what he needed wasn't a wife exactly. What he needed was help. Practical, consistent, willing help. Someone to handle the domestic work so he could focus on the land. Someone who could feed the chickens and keep the cabin and maybe help with calving season. Someone who asked for little and gave much. He told himself he had realistic expectations. He was wrong about that, too. He rode into Bitter Ridge at 10 o'clock, tied his horse outside the depot, and stood on the platform with his hat pulled low and his collar turned up against the September wind that came off the Rockies with ice already in it. A few other men from ranches outside town were there, picking up supply orders. Walt Gruber from the Double G gave him a nod. Pete Calloway, who ran the saddle shop, was waiting on a leather shipment and pretended not to see him. Pete Calloway owed Ethan's father a favor from 15 years ago, and somehow that meant he couldn't look Ethan in the eye now that the Mercer place was struggling. People in Bitter Ridge were like that. They respected success loudly and ignored failure politely, and Ethan had learned that the distance between the two conditions was considerable and crossed faster than anyone expected. Silas Crowley was there too. That surprised Ethan, and it shouldn't have. Crowley had a way of being places where he could observe other people's business. He was a large man, well-fed and well-dressed, in the way that men were when they'd been taking money from others for long enough that they'd forgotten what earning it felt like. He owned the largest cattle operation in the county, 300 acres on the south side of Bitter Ridge, and he had recently acquired 2 more ranches through means that everybody suspected and nobody had proven. He had a way of smiling that never touched his eyes. He saw Ethan on the platform and walked over. He always walked over. Ethan. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it because not shaking it would have been a declaration, and he wasn't ready for declarations. Silas. Hear you're expecting a delivery today. There was something in the way he said it, the slight weight on the word delivery, as though a woman were a parcel, that made Ethan's jaw tighten. Just picking someone up. Your mail order, woman. Crowley said it plainly, not whispering. Walt Gruber looked over. The station agent behind the window looked up from his ledger. Heard you sent off for one. Smart move, maybe. Man in your situation needs all the help he can get. Ethan said nothing. My offer on the North Pasture still stands, you know, Crowley said, in the same tone, casual and patient, the way a cat is patient. $400. That'd cover your banknote and leave you something besides. You could start smaller. Nothing wrong with smaller. I'm not selling the North Pasture, Silas. Not yet. And Crowley smiled. Well, let's see what the train brings then. He stepped back and waited along with everyone else. The train came in 4 minutes late, which seemed appropriate to Ethan. Nothing in his life arrived on time or in the shape he expected. The first passengers off were a traveling merchant with 2 large cases and a family with 3 children who immediately scattered across the platform. Then an older couple moving slowly, helping each other with their bags. Then a young ranch hand who looked barely 17 and wore a new hat, like he was trying to convince someone of something. And then Helena Barrett stepped onto the platform, and Ethan Mercer's carefully constructed realistic expectations fell apart completely. She was not what the blurry photograph had suggested, or rather, the photograph had suggested volume and presence without being specific about the degree of either. Helena Barrett was a large woman, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of sturdy build that certain men in certain decades would call imposing. And that really meant something simpler, which was that she occupied space with complete confidence and seemed entirely comfortable doing so. She wore a dark traveling dress that was well made but not fancy, a practical coat, and a hat she'd pinned firmly against the wind before she even stepped off the train, as if she'd been told about Wyoming winds specifically and taken the warning seriously. She carried 2 bags, carried them herself, didn't wait for a porter, and in her right hand she held a leather ledger, old and fat with use, with pages sticking out at irregular angles. She stood on the platform and looked at Bitter Ridge with the same expression a surveyor uses when he's calculating a job. Not awed, not dismayed, assessing. Ethan heard a sound that might have been a smothered laugh from somewhere behind him. He didn't turn around to see where it came from because he was looking at Helena Barrett, and she was looking directly at him, and there was nothing in her expression that suggested she'd heard anything or cared if she had. She walked straight to him. He was the only man on the platform holding flowers. A sorry bunch of prairie wildflowers he'd picked an hour ago that had already wilted halfway in the wind. And apparently that was identification enough. Ethan Mercer, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. He held out the wilted flowers somewhat helplessly. She took them, glanced at them, and tucked them under her arm with the same practicality she'd use for a receipt. Helena Barrett, it's good to meet you. She shook his hand, actually shook it, firm and brief. Your fence line on the south approach is down in 2 places. I saw it from the train. Ethan blinked. Yes, I've been meaning to, and your east pasture looks like it's carrying far fewer cattle than the acreage suggests it should. Possible overgrazing on the sections nearest the creek, or disease, or selling down. Which is it? Somewhere behind him, there was genuine silence now. The kind of silence that meant people had stopped pretending not to listen. Little of all 3, Ethan said carefully. Helena Barrett nodded as though this was useful information rather than an embarrassing confession. She looked past him at the road leading out of town, then back at his face, reading something there the way she'd read the landscape from the train window. "Well," she said, "we should probably get going. I'd like to see the books before dark." The books. That was the phrase that stayed with Ethan during the entire ride back to the homestead, Helena Barrett sitting beside him on the wagon seat with her leather ledger on her lap and the wilted flowers still tucked under her arm because she apparently didn't intend to drop anything she'd picked up. The books. Not the kitchen, not the cabin, not what she'd be cooking for supper, or where she'd be sleeping, or any of the 100 domestic arrangements that Ethan had vaguely imagined would be the first order of business. The books. He said, after a while, "You have experience with ranch finances?" "I have experience with numbers," she said. "Ranch finances are just numbers with dirt on them." He wasn't sure if that was a joke. Her face didn't particularly clarify the question. "Miss Barrett." "Helena." "Helena." He shifted the reins in his hands. The horse, an old brown mare named Consequence, plodded steadily in a way that suggested she'd been walking this road for years and found nothing about it interesting anymore. "I want to be honest with you about the situation here. Please do. The ranch is struggling, significantly. I have a bank debt that I'm behind on, my cattle numbers are down considerably from where they were 2 years ago, and I've had trouble with the East Pasture water source that I haven't been able to solve." He paused. "I wrote to the Bureau because I needed help on the domestic side of things, so I could focus more of my time on the land. That was my thinking." Helena Barrett was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass on either side of the road in long, slow waves. "That's honest," she said. "Here's my honesty in return. I came here because the Bureau's description of your situation sounded specific in ways that interested me. A man losing a working ranch piece by piece is almost never losing it purely to bad weather or bad luck. In my experience, there's usually a structural problem, financial, operational, or external, that can be identified and addressed if someone takes the time to look at the full picture." She paused. "I intend to look at the full picture," Ethan said slowly. "I asked for someone to help with the chickens." "I'll help with the chickens," Helena said pleasantly, "after I look at the books." She looked at the books that evening while Ethan made supper. He'd been cooking for himself long enough that he had a system, such as it was, and she sat at the rough-hewn table near the window with the account ledger open in front of her, and her own leather ledger beside it, and she worked in the kind of focused silence that made a person feel that even the air around her was paying attention. He watched her from the corner of his eye while he moved around the small kitchen. He found himself looking for reactions on her face and finding almost none. She turned pages slowly. She made small notes in her ledger, transferring numbers, comparing columns. Once she set her pencil down and pressed 2 fingers to her mouth and stared at a page for a very long time. And something about the quality of that stillness made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. He set a bowl in front of her, beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was about as honest a meal as he could offer. And she thanked him without looking up, and he sat across from her and ate, and tried not to feel like he was waiting for a verdict. "Your loan interest rate," she said finally. 8%, he said. "Standard." "The original loan document says 6. He put his spoon down. "What?" She turned the ledger around so he could see the page. Her finger rested below a row of numbers that didn't mean anything to him immediately, but she traced across the line and then to the margin, where she'd written his original interest figure and the calculated rate he'd actually been charged. "Someone at the bank adjusted the rate at some point in the last 18 months, she said. "Not dramatically, but consistently. You've been overpaying your interest by approximately $40 per year." Ethan stared at the numbers. $40 wasn't his salvation. But $40 was $40 when you had 82 in a tin box under the floorboard. "Could be a clerical error," he said. She looked at him with calm, dark eyes that said very clearly that she did not think it was a clerical error but was willing to extend him the comfort of the possibility for now. "I'd like to see the loan origination documents. Do you have them?" "In the box by the stove." He got up and retrieved them without asking why or discussing it further, which later he would recognize as the first moment he genuinely changed the way he related to Helena Barrett. He just got up and got them, because something in her manner made it seem like the obvious and natural thing to do. She spread the origination documents next to the ledger and looked between them. and Ethan sat back down and ate his cornbread and watched the oil lamp throw moving shadows across her face while she worked. After a long while, she said, "How well do you know Silas Crowley?" The beans in Ethan's stomach went suddenly cold. "Well enough," he said. "Why?" "He's named in your loan documentation as a co-guarantor. That's unusual for a private loan from a territorial bank. Normally, the bank assumes the risk." She tapped the page with her pencil eraser. "It means Crowley had standing involvement with your debt from the beginning, which raises a question about who benefits if the debt goes unpaid." Ethan didn't answer right away. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. "Crowley's been trying to buy my north pasture," he said, "for about a year now." "Has he?" It wasn't quite a question. She looked at the documents again. "Did he name a price?" $400. She wrote it down. "That's almost exactly your current debt," she said. The room got very quiet. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved around the cabin with its usual indifference to everything happening inside, and Ethan sat across the table from a woman he'd known for approximately 7 hours and felt something shift in his understanding of his own situation. A slow, grinding shift, like ice breaking up on a river in early spring, and just as cold. "He wants me to fail," Ethan said. Not a realization exactly. More like saying a thing out loud that he'd known in some wordless part of himself for a long time and hadn't let himself form into actual words. Helena didn't answer immediately. She closed the ledger carefully, her own, not his, and set her pencil down and looked at him across the table with an expression that was careful and precise, like everything else about her. "I don't know that yet," she said, "but I intend to find out." She picked up her spoon and ate her beans. They went cold while she was working, but she ate them without comment, without complaint. And when she finished, she washed the bowl herself and set it to dry on the shelf and said goodnight and went to the small room off the back of the cabin that Ethan had cleaned out and made up as best he could. He sat at the table for a long time after that, looking at his account ledger lying open in the lamplight, with her careful pencil marks in the margin. Questions written beside his numbers, small precise arrows connecting figures he'd never thought to connect. He thought about what Crowley had said on the platform. "Let's see what the train brings then." He thought about the way she'd stepped off that train and stood on the platform of Bitter Ridge and looked at the town with the same expression a general uses when he's reading unfamiliar terrain. He thought about the 4 remaining chickens in the yard, which were the last animals on this place that were reliably producing anything. He blew out the lamp. He went to bed. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about a lot of things. And somewhere in the middle of all of them, he realized that whatever he had expected the train to bring him, what had actually arrived was something he was only beginning to understand the size of. By morning, everything on this ranch was going to look different. He didn't know yet whether that frightened him or not. He fell asleep before he decided. He woke before she did, which surprised him, because he'd expected a woman who worked the way she worked to sleep the way tired people sleep, deep and long and hard to pull back from. But when he came out of his room at 5:30, the lamp on the table was already lit, low and steady, and Helena Barrett was sitting exactly where he'd left her the night before, in the same chair, with the same ledgers open in front of her, except now there were 3 more documents spread across the table that he recognized as coming from the box by the stove, documents he hadn't looked at in over a year because looking at them made his chest feel like something was sitting on it. She had a cup of coffee in front of her that had gone cold, and she didn't look up when he came in. "You slept," he said, because he felt like he needed to confirm it. "A few hours." She turned a page. "There's coffee on the stove. I found the tin." He poured himself a cup and stood by the stove and drank it, and looked at the back of her head and the spread of documents, and tried to remember if anyone had ever sat at that table and worked that hard at something that was technically his problem. "Did you find anything else?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment that had thought in it rather than hesitation. "Sit down, Ethan." He sat down. She turned the ledger around and showed him a column she'd constructed herself overnight. His numbers transferred into her system, reorganized by category and timeline, and beside each entry she'd written a small note in handwriting so precise it looked almost printed. She walked through it, the way a doctor walks a patient through an X-ray, pointing at things without drama, letting the picture do the work. The interest rate discrepancy wasn't an isolated error. She'd found 3 separate places in the loan documentation where figures had been adjusted. Small adjustments, the kind that a man not looking for them would never find, the kind that accumulated over time into something that looked, when you laid it out in a column the way Helena had laid it out, like a very deliberate and patient plan. The cattle weights, she said, moving to the second document. Your sale records from the last 2 years. You sold through the Bitter Ridge Livestock Exchange? Only exchange within 100 miles. Crowley sits on the board of the exchange. Ethan set his coffee down. I know that. Your recorded weights are consistently low, not dramatically, between 4 and 7% on each sale. Over 2 years in the volume you were selling at, that's... She pointed to a figure she'd written at the bottom of the column. Approximately $90 in underpaid revenue. The number hit him somewhere between the ribs. $90. He'd been scratching and scraping for every dollar of that 82 in the tin box, and somewhere in the accounting of the last 2 years was $90 that should have been his and hadn't been, because someone had put their thumb on the scale. Not someone. Crowley. I need you to be careful, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. What you're describing, if you're right, and I'm not saying you're wrong, that's a man with money and lawyers and friends in Cheyenne. If he finds out where... He already knows you're struggling, Helena said. She said it plainly, not cruelly. The question isn't whether Crowley is watching you. He's been watching you for 2 years. The question is what he doesn't know yet, and right now what he doesn't know is that someone has looked at these numbers and understood what they mean. She closed the document carefully. I'd like to keep it that way for a while. Ethan looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, with the early morning dark still pressed against the windows and the smell of the cold coffee between them, she looked like someone who had thought about difficult things for a long time and had stopped being frightened by them. He wasn't sure if that reassured him or unsettled him, maybe both. What do you want to do? He asked. Today? She stood up, stretching her back in a way that suggested it had been complaining for a while and she'd been ignoring it. Today I want to look at your cattle. She spent the morning with the cattle in a way that Ethan found difficult to categorize. She didn't just walk through the herd. She moved through it slowly, stopping to look at individual animals, checking teeth and hooves and the condition of coats, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew what she was looking for. She asked him questions about their water source, about how he was rotating the pasture, about the quality of the hay he'd been putting up. Some of the questions made him defensive. Most of them made him realize, with a low, uncomfortable feeling, that he hadn't been doing things the way his father had taught him. That somewhere in the last 2 years of stress and debt and grinding worry, he'd let the management of the remaining herd slip from careful to adequate to something worse than adequate. The creek on the east side, she said. You said it's been a problem. Dries up by August most years. Last 2 summers it was gone by July. Where are they drinking through August and September? I haul water from the main well. It takes time. Takes a lot of time. She was quiet, looking at the east fence line, and then she walked it, actually walked the full length of it, which was a 1/4 mile, while Ethan followed behind her, trying not to feel like a man being inspected. She stopped at the lowest point of the terrain, where the land dipped before rising again toward the ridge. There's subsurface water here, she said. How can you tell? The grass is different. That dark green strip, it's pulling moisture from somewhere, even in drought conditions. Your father didn't sink a well here? No. Why not? He opened his mouth and closed it. He didn't know. It had never occurred to him, and apparently it had never occurred to his father, and now this woman who'd been on his land for less than 18 hours was pointing at a strip of darker grass and suggesting that the answer to his water problem had been sitting in his own east pasture the whole time. It would need testing, she said. I'm not certain, but it's worth testing. She walked back toward the cabin. He stood at the fence line looking at the darker grass for a moment longer than necessary. The friction started at lunch. Not a fight exactly. More like 2 people discovering the specific shape of their disagreements. Ethan had certain ideas about how a ranch was run. Ideas inherited from his father, calcified by years of doing things one way. And Helena had different ideas, and some of her ideas were good, which made the ones he resisted harder to dismiss. She suggested changing the grazing rotation so the south pasture could rest through October. He said the south pasture was the best grass they had, and resting it in fall made no sense. She said resting it in fall was exactly why it would be better grassed by spring. He said she'd been on this land for one morning. She said the land didn't care how long she'd been there. They didn't resolve it. They ate in something that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite conversation, and Ethan cleared the plates and Helena went back to her ledger. And he went out to fix the section of east fence that had been down for 3 weeks. He worked alone in the cold afternoon air and thought about things. He thought about how his father had run this place, efficiently, proudly, without debt. He thought about the series of decisions and misfortunes that had reduced 300 acres and 60 cattle to what it was now. He thought about Silas Crowley standing on the platform at Bitter Ridge and smiling with his face while his eyes did something entirely different. He thought about Helena's column of numbers and the $90 that should have been his. By the time he came back in at dusk, he'd decided something. He wasn't sure it was a wise decision, but it was honest, which he'd found over the years was sometimes better than wise. The South pasture, he said. She was at the stove, making something that smelled considerably better than his beans from last night. You might be right about it. She turned around and looked at him. I might be? Don't push it. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. I'm saying I'll try it your way this fall and see what comes of it in spring. She nodded, turned back to the stove. The fence on the east side, did you get it fixed? 3 sections. There's a 4th just south of the rock outcropping. I noticed it this afternoon. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen and counted to 5 silently and said, I'll get it tomorrow. I know, she said. I'm not reminding you because I think you forgot. I'm reminding you because I walked past it at 3 o'clock and there were 2 of your cattle on the wrong side of it. He went to the window and looked out at the darkening yard. And sure enough, 2 cattle were standing in the section between the broken fence and the road, cheerful and indifferent to the amount of trouble they could have gotten into. He put his coat back on. Matt. 3 weeks passed in the way that work-heavy days pass when you're too tired at the end of each one to do much besides eat and sleep. Quickly in terms of the calendar, slowly in terms of the body. Ethan and Helena settled into a rhythm that neither of them had designed or discussed. She woke early and worked on the finances and planning. He worked the land and the cattle through the morning. They worked together in the afternoons on whatever needed 2 people, which turned out to be most things. She was not easy to work with. She was precise in the way that made imprecision feel like a personal failing, and she had opinions about the right way to do almost everything. And most of her opinions were grounded in logic that he found difficult to argue with even when the logic irritated him. She didn't apologize for knowing things. She also didn't rub it in, which he came to appreciate because the alternative would have been much worse. She fixed the collapsed roof on the storage outbuilding herself one afternoon, which he came home from checking the cattle to find already half done. He stood in the yard and watched her work for a minute. She moved carefully, methodically, testing boards before trusting her weight to them. And he felt something complicated that he didn't examine too closely. You didn't have to do that, he said. The canvas was rotting, she said from the roof. Hand me that board. He handed it up. Where'd you learn to roof? My uncle's farm in Ohio. I spent 3 summers there when I was young. Ohio, he said. That explained the water stain on his ceiling in a roundabout way. She looked down at him from the roof with an expression that was almost a smile. Almost. The chickens, it turned out, she was also very good with. She reorganized their co-op, not dramatically, just efficiently, and she identified that 2 of the 4 remaining birds were laying poorly because of something in their feed, and she adjusted the feed, and within 10 days, all 4 chickens were producing again, with a consistency that Ethan found privately humbling. She'd solved the chicken problem in 10 days when it had been declining steadily for 8 months. He didn't say anything about it directly, but one evening he set 2 extra biscuits on her plate without explanation, and she looked at them and then at him and went back to eating, and that was the whole of it. It was on the 17th day that things cracked open. Helena had ridden into Bitter Ridge alone. She'd asked for the use of the horse, which he'd granted without thinking too hard about why she wanted it, which he recognized later as a failure of curiosity on his part. And she came back in the late afternoon with her jaw set in the particular way he'd learned meant she had information she was still processing. She unsaddled the horse herself and came into the cabin and poured herself water and drank half of it standing at the counter before she spoke. I went to the bank, she said. Ethan put down the harness he'd been mending. Why? I told them I was your wife and I needed to review the account records for our household finances. She said it without apology or particular emphasis. They let me. Men in banks in 1884 let women look at household finances because they don't believe women will understand what they're looking at. He decided not to unpack the "told them I was your wife" part of that for the moment. What did you find? She sat down and opened her ledger and turned to a page near the back that was dense with figures. Your original loan was issued through the Cattlemen's Bank of Cheyenne. The bank's branch manager here in Bitter Ridge is a man named Randall Fitch. I asked to see the branch records for your account as part of reviewing our household finances, and Fitch showed them to me because I presented myself as confused about the interest payments, and he was condescending enough to want to explain it to me slowly. And? The rate adjustment happened 16 months ago. Fitch initialed it. She pointed to a transcribed entry in her ledger. But the instruction came from above his level. There's a corresponding entry in the branch communication log. I asked to see that too, telling him I needed to verify a letter we'd supposedly received. And there's a directive from the territorial office dated 3 days before Fitch made the change. She paused. The directive references the Bitter Ridge account by number. Your account. Specifically. The fire in the stove made a sound. Neither of them moved. Someone in the territorial office targeted my loan, Ethan said. Someone with enough standing to direct a branch manager to alter a rate on a specific account. She looked at him steadily. Crowley sits on the board of the Wyoming Territorial Cattlemen's Association, which has formal advisory standing with the Territorial Banking Office. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. That's not proof, Ethan said. He said it because it was true, and because saying it out loud helped him think. No, she agreed. It's a thread. But it's a thread that connects to your cattle weights, which connect to the exchange board, which connects back to Crowley. She put her pencil down. This isn't bad luck, Ethan. This isn't drought and misfortune. Someone has been pulling this place apart piece by piece, carefully enough that each piece looked like ordinary misfortune. He stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the yard and the fence line and the barn with its tired lean, and he thought about 2 years of believing he was failing because he wasn't good enough, wasn't working hard enough, wasn't his father. 2 years of that weight. Why, he said to the window. He could buy a dozen ranches. What's special about this land? I don't know yet, Helena said behind him, but I intend to find out. He turned around. She was looking at him with the same careful, precise expression she used for everything difficult. Not softened, not dramatic, just direct and steady. What do you want to do with what you have? He asked. I want to go see Silas Crowley. His stomach dropped approximately 4 inches. Helena, not to confront him, not yet. She held up one hand, and something in the gesture, the patience in it, the control, made him stop. I want to look at him. I want to see how he responds to meeting me. A man like Crowley has spent years dealing with men. He knows how men fight, how men negotiate, how men retreat. He won't know what to make of me, and that means he might show me something he'd never show you. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the table threw her shadow up the wall behind her, large and still. He's going to underestimate you, Ethan said slowly. Yes, she said. He will. They went into Bitter Ridge together on a Thursday, which was the day Crowley typically did business at the exchange. Helena had dressed deliberately, not fancily, but with a certain composed formality that changed the way she occupied a room even before she said anything. She carried her ledger. She always carried her ledger. Ethan walked beside her into the exchange building, which smelled of livestock and pipe tobacco and old paper, and the men inside looked up the way men in those rooms always looked up when something unexpected walked in. Crowley was at the far end, talking to 2 ranchers Ethan recognized from the county to the south. He saw them come in, and something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He came over. He didn't rush, but he came. Ethan. He nodded, and then he looked at Helena with the particular species of studied courtesy that men of his type deployed when they were deciding what category to put a person in. And this must be your bride. Helena Mercer, she said, and extended her hand. He shook it. She held the handshake a beat longer than he expected, and Ethan watched Crowley's eyes flick down to her ledger and back to her face. I've heard a great deal about you, Mr. Crowley. Nothing scandalous, I hope. He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced. Only that you've been very interested in my husband's north pasture. She said it pleasantly, conversationally, with absolutely nothing on her face. I looked at the land myself this week. I can see why you'd want it. Crowley's eyes shifted, barely, briefly, to Ethan, and then back to Helena. It's good land, he said. Good water access, good elevation for the winter pasture. I've offered fair value. You've offered exactly what he owes the bank, Helena said, still pleasant, which is an interesting coincidence. The smile didn't leave his face, but something behind it changed. Ethan could see it, now that he was looking for it. The slight stillness, the new quality of attention. I don't know that I'd call it a coincidence, Crowley said. I'd call it a reasonable offer calibrated to a man's situation. Of course. Helena tucked her ledger more firmly under her arm. Well, we're not selling, as you know, but I did want to put a face to the name. You're something of a legend in this part of the territory. She smiled at him. It was a perfectly nice smile. It's good to finally meet the man who's been so invested in our finances. She said our finances the way a person drops a coin into a cup, lightly, letting it fall exactly where she intended, watching for the sound it made. Crowley looked at her for a moment that was one moment too long, and then he said, Well, I hope you'll find Bitter Ridge welcoming, Mrs. Mercer. It's a fine community. I'm sure it is, she said. They left. Ethan held himself together until they were half a block down the road, and then he said, under his breath, What did you just do? I let him know that I exist, she said without slowing her pace, and that I've been looking at the finances. She glanced sideways at him. He'll underestimate what I know. But he'll stop assuming you're alone in this. That changes his timeline. His timeline for what? She was quiet for a half-block step. For whatever he was planning to do next. Crowley's response came sooner than Ethan expected, and it came in a form that Ethan hadn't anticipated, which suggested Crowley was more rattled than he'd let on at the exchange. 2 days after the visit to Bitter Ridge, Randall Fitch rode out to the homestead in the middle of a cold morning. He came alone, which was itself unusual for a bankman making what he called a courtesy visit, and he sat across from Ethan at the table with his hat in his hands and explained, carefully, regretfully, with the particular bureaucratic sadness of a man delivering bad news he had no personal feelings about, that the bank had reviewed the Mercer account and found it necessary to accelerate the repayment schedule. Not all of it, just the outstanding interest, brought current, within 60 days, which was $112, which Ethan did not have. He heard Helena come in from the back room while Fitch was still talking. He didn't look at her. Fitch didn't look at her either, which was a mistake. Mr. Fitch, she said from behind Ethan's left shoulder, would you mind clarifying the provision in the original loan documentation that permits acceleration of the interest schedule? Fitch looked at her, then back at Ethan, then at her again. I beg your pardon? Section 4 of the original loan agreement, she said, which I have read carefully. She set a document on the table in front of Fitch. It was the origination paperwork, with 2 specific passages underlined in her precise penciled hand. The acceleration clause permits the bank to accelerate repayment only in the event of abandonment, voluntary default, or transfer of the secured property. None of those conditions apply to the Mercer account. She sat down across from Fitch with the ledger in front of her. So I'm wondering on what basis the bank believes the acceleration is permissible. Fitch looked at the document. He was a middle-aged man, soft in the way that indoor work made men soft. And he was not prepared for this. It was written on him plainly. There are banking procedures, he began. There's a contract, Helena said. Contracts supersede internal procedure. If the bank attempts to accelerate repayment outside the contract terms, that's not a courtesy visit we'd need. That's a legal proceeding. She looked at him with perfect calm. Does the bank have a lawyer in Cheyenne? Well, we do, she said. It was not entirely true, but it was not entirely a lie either, because Helena Barrett, Helena Mercer now, apparently, a fact Ethan was still catching up to, had a cousin in Laramie who'd read law, and that was close enough for the purposes of this specific conversation with Randall Fitch on a cold Thursday morning. Fitch left 20 minutes later without anything signed and without any agreed acceleration of anything. He rode back toward Bitter Ridge, and Ethan watched him go and then looked at Helena, who was making a note in her ledger as though it had been an ordinary meeting. He's going to go straight to Crowley, Ethan said. Yes. She wrote something down. And Crowley is going to be angry. Yes. And then what? She looked up from the ledger, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the train at Bitter Ridge with her old leather ledger and her wilted, borrowed flowers and her surveyor's eyes, she looked like she was doing the calculation and hadn't finished it yet. Then we find out what Crowley does when his quiet methods stop working, she said. She said it evenly. But her pencil had stopped moving, and her hand, Ethan noticed, was resting very still against the page. It was the first time he'd seen anything like uncertainty in her, and it should have frightened him more than it did. Instead, for reasons he couldn't have explained precisely, it made him trust her more, not less. He pulled a chair out and sat down across from her at the table that had become, without either of them deciding it, the command center of whatever this was turning into. "Tell me what we know for certain," he said. "All of it. And then we figure out what to do next." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, but opening, like a window in a room that had been closed for a long time. She opened the ledger to the beginning and started from the first entry. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the cold grass, and somewhere in the distance, Silas Crowley was riding toward his office with something new to think about, and none of them, not Ethan, not Helena, not Crowley, could see yet exactly where the road ahead was going to break. Crowley waited 9 days before he did anything. That was the part that bothered Ethan most. Not the waiting itself, but the quality of it. The deliberate patience that suggested a man who had more than one option available and was taking his time selecting the right one. In those 9 days, Helena drilled the east pasture at the spot where the grass ran dark and came up with water at 11 feet, which was 3 feet shallower than the well by the cabin and considerably cleaner. Ethan stood at the edge of the test hole and looked down at the dark, wet earth and felt something complicated move through him. Gratitude and inadequacy traveling together the way they sometimes did, occupying the same space without resolving into either one. She'd been right. The water had been there the whole time. They also sold 4 cattle at the exchange in Laramie instead of Bitter Ridge. Helena had suggested the change of venue, quietly, without making a production of it, and came back with a price per head that was $6 higher than what Ethan had been receiving locally. $6 per head. He'd been driving his cattle to the closer market for 2 years and leaving $6 per animal on the table. He did the arithmetic in his head on the ride home and stopped doing it because the number it produced was one he didn't want to sit with. The 9 days passed, and on the 10th morning, Walt Gruber rode in from the Double G. Ethan was in the yard when he came up the road, and he could tell from the set of Walt's shoulders before he even got close that this wasn't a social call. Walt Gruber was a decent man. Not a brave one, not particularly, but decent in the way that counted for something, which was that when he had bad news for a neighbor, he delivered it himself instead of letting it arrive by rumor. He climbed down from his horse and shook Ethan's hand and said, without much preamble, "Crowley's been talking." "About what?" "About you. About your situation." Walt turned his hat in his hands. "About your wife." Ethan went still. "What about her?" "Nothing specific. Nothing he could be called on directly. You know how he talks." Walt's jaw was tight. "He's been saying that she came out here to get her hands on your land because she couldn't get a better offer elsewhere. That the finances she's been looking at, the trip to the bank, he's telling people she's working an angle, that you don't see it because he's saying you're not in a position to think clearly right now, given your situation." The words landed with a specific kind of weight, not because they were true, because they were the kind of thing that spread in a small community the way water found cracks, not through any one dramatic moment, but through slow, persistent seepage, until the damage was already done before anyone noticed it happening. "He's discrediting her," Ethan said. "He's trying to." Walt put his hat back on. "I thought you should know." Helena was in the doorway when Ethan turned around. He didn't know how long she'd been standing there, and he couldn't read from her face how much she'd heard, but he suspected it was enough. Walt nodded at her, respectful and slightly awkward. "Mrs. Mercer." "Mr. Gruber," she said. "Thank you for coming." After he left, Ethan went inside and closed the door and stood in the middle of the cabin, not quite sure what to do with his hands. "Helena, I know what he's doing," she said. She was already at the table, ledger open, but she wasn't writing. She was sitting very straight with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes focused on something that wasn't in the room. He can't come at the evidence directly, so he comes at the person who found it. If I'm discredited, the numbers stop meaning anything. We should go faster, she said. We need to move faster than his story does. She said it with certainty, but there was something underneath it. A tension in the line of her shoulders, the smallest tightening around her eyes, that told Ethan she was angrier than she was showing and holding it very deliberately in check. He sat down across from her. Are you all right? She looked at him. The question seemed to catch her off guard, which caught him off guard, because it was not a complicated question. But maybe nobody had asked it recently in a way that expected an honest answer. I've been called worse things, she said finally, by people who had less reason to be afraid of me. It wasn't bravado, it was just the truth, stated plainly, and Ethan believed it completely. All right, he said. Tell me what we need to do. What they needed, Helena explained, was documentation that could stand on its own without her having to stand behind it. Evidence so clear and so well organized that a reasonable person looking at it without knowing anything about Helena Barrett would see what it showed. She'd been building toward this, but Crowley's move had accelerated the need. They couldn't wait for the full picture to assemble itself slowly. They needed the core of it now. The cattle weight fraud was the most documentable. She had Ethan's sale records, and she had the figures she'd copied from the exchange's official log during a visit to Bitter Ridge she'd made while Ethan was checking the south pasture fence. She had the discrepancies laid out in a format that didn't require interpretation, just arithmetic. The numbers were either consistent or they weren't, and they weren't. The interest rate manipulation required the original loan document against the bank's own branch records, which she had in transcription from her visit to Fitch. It wasn't as airtight as she'd like. A transcription made by the account holder's wife wasn't the same as the original document, but it was enough to raise questions that a court of law would want to answer. She needed one more thing. She needed someone in Cheyenne who could file a formal inquiry with the Territorial Banking Office before Crowley's influence there could be used to make the records disappear. Your father's lawyer, she said, the one who handled the original Homestead filing. Is he still in practice? Ethan thought. Arthur Keene, he was in Laramie. I haven't spoken to him since my father died. Would he remember the family? My father helped him get started. Lent him money when he was setting up his office, early on. He paid it back, but Ethan shrugged. He'd remember. Write to him tonight. Tell him you need a formal consultation on a contract dispute, and that time is a factor. She looked at him steadily. Don't mention Crowley by name yet. Not in a letter. She was thinking 3 moves ahead, and Ethan was tracking 2 of them and guessing at the third, but he was tracking enough to see the shape of what she was doing. She was building a case the way a careful carpenter builds a structure. Each piece fitted precisely. Nothing decorative, everything load-bearing. He wrote to Arthur Keene that evening while Helena organized the documentation into a sequence that told its story without requiring explanation. They worked at opposite ends of the table, the lamp between them throwing light on both their papers, and outside the Wyoming dark came down full and cold and complete. It was almost comfortable. That was the word that came to Ethan, obscurely, as he sealed the letter. Almost. Like something that could become comfortable if it kept going in this direction long enough. He did not examine that thought carefully. There wasn't time. The fire came on the 14th night. Ethan woke to the smell first. Smoke, the specific sharp smell of dry hay burning fast. And then the orange light pulsing against the window glass. And he was on his feet and moving before he was fully awake, his body making decisions while his mind was still catching up. The barn. He went through the door and across the yard, and the barn was already burning hard on the east side, the old dry timber taking the fire with an eagerness that told him it had been set, not sparked. No lightning, no lantern accident spread like this fast, this deliberately along one wall. He had the water bucket from the yard, and he was throwing water at it before he knew that throwing water at it was useless, because the fire had too much of a head start, and the hay inside was acting like kindling. He got the 2 horses out. Got them out because he ran into the smoke and went blind for a moment and found them by sound, by the panicked weight of them pulling against him, and he hauled them out by pure stubbornness into the yard and tied them to the post by the cabin and turned around, and the barn's east wall was gone, fully gone, a wall of orange going up into the black sky. Helena was beside him. He didn't know when she'd come out. She was in her coat over her nightclothes, her hair down, and she had the rifle from above the door in her hands. There are men on the ridge, she said. He looked where she was looking. The ridge line to the north caught the firelight on one side, and against that light he could see shapes, movement. 3, maybe 4 men on horseback, watching from above. His stomach went to ice. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just arson. They'd come to watch it burn. They'd come to make sure. Get inside, he said. No, she said. Helena, they're watching to see if we run, she said, her voice low and even. If we run, they know we're finished. If we don't run, they have to decide what to do next. She raised the rifle and sighted toward the ridge. Not at anyone, just a clear visible motion, making sure they could see in the firelight that she had it. They need to know we're not finished. Ethan stood in his yard with his burning barn behind him and looked at the shapes on the ridge and understood what she was doing. She was communicating in the only language men like these spoke clearly: willingness. One of the shapes on the ridge moved, another followed. After a long moment, they turned and rode north, away, and were gone into the dark. The barn burned for another 2 hours. There was nothing to be done about the barn. They sat in the cabin when it was over, the fire reduced to a smoldering ruin in the yard, and the smell of it heavy on everything. Ethan's hands were burned on the palms from the rope he'd used to haul the horses out. Not badly, blistered in 2 places. And Helena had wrapped them without being asked, working quietly and efficiently with the cloth she'd torn from some. They'll come back, he said. Yes. She tied off the wrapping. But not tonight. Tonight was a message. They'll wait to see how we respond. We can't rebuild the barn, not fast enough to matter, not with what we have. No. She sat back. Her face in the lamplight was tired, genuinely tired, the kind that didn't hide anything. But I don't think the barn was the main objective. What was? The horses were in the barn. She said it quietly. The horses and the documentation. She looked at him. If you'd lost the horses, you couldn't ride for help. If you'd lost the documentation, if it had been stored in the barn, the way most ranchers keep important papers in an outbuilding, there would be nothing left to file. Ethan stared at her. You keep the documentation in the cabin. In the lining of my travel bag, she said, since the 2nd week. He thought about that. He thought about the fact that she had anticipated and prepared for someone coming after the evidence. She'd done it quietly, without telling him, which meant she'd known it might frighten him or make him reconsider something, and had decided to protect him from that particular worry by carrying it herself. He didn't know whether to be grateful or unsettled by that. He ended up somewhere between the two. Helena. He waited until she looked at him. Why didn't you tell me? She was quiet for a moment, and it was a different quality of quiet than her working silences. More personal, more considered. Because you were already carrying as much as you could carry, she said. And I wasn't sure yet that I was right. I didn't want to add fear without certainty. It was in its way one of the kindest things anyone had said to him in 2 years. He didn't have the words for that, so he didn't try. All right, he said. What do we do now? Tomorrow morning, I need you to ride to Walt Gruber's and ask if one of his men can come stay here during the day for the next week. We need a 3rd person visible on this land. It won't stop them, but it changes what they think they're dealing with. She picked up her pencil. I'm also going to write the letter to Cheyenne tonight, not Keene, directly to the territorial office. I'm going to file a formal notice of contractual dispute under my name. Your name. My name is less known to Crowley's contacts than yours, and a woman filing a formal banking dispute in 1884 is unusual enough that it will take time for them to understand what it means. She looked at him with something that might have been, in another light, the smallest possible version of grim humor. Men underestimate paperwork filed by women. They always have. I intend to exploit that for as long as it's useful. Ethan looked at her across the table. This woman who'd arrived 26 days ago with a blurry photograph and a leather ledger and wilted flowers tucked under her arm. And he thought about all the things he'd assumed on the platform at Bitter Ridge and how wrong every single one of them had been. You've done this before, he said. Not an accusation, just a recognition. She held his gaze for a moment. Not this exactly, she said, but something like it. In Ohio, smaller stakes, different men. A pause. I didn't win that one. It was the first crack in the wall she kept around her history, and it was narrow, but it was real, and Ethan didn't push on it. He just received it. "You'll win this one," he said. She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that moved and then steadied, like water after a stone. "We," she said, "will win this one." The prisoner changed everything. He came 3 nights after the barn fire, which suggested that Crowley had interpreted their lack of fleeing as defiance rather than defeat, and had decided to escalate. This time, they didn't announce themselves with fire. This time, there were 4 of them, and they came in the dark on foot across the east pasture, which was the approach with the most cover and the least visibility from the cabin windows. What they didn't know was that Helena had spent 2 of the 3 intervening days quietly repositioning things. She'd moved the horses to Walt Gruber's, a sacrifice of convenience that hurt practically but removed the leverage of the horses from the equation. She'd mapped the approaches to the cabin from every direction with a specificity that made Ethan realize, watching her do it, that she was doing something he didn't have a name for yet, something between military planning and chess, and she was good at it. She'd identified the east pasture as the most likely approach and had suggested, with no particular emotion, that Ethan sleep with the rifle loaded and close. He'd done it. He hadn't slept much, but he'd done it. He heard them when they crossed the yard fence, because she'd strung a length of wire low across the gate tied to 3 empty tin cans she'd taken from the kitchen, and the cans made a sound in the dark that was small but specific. He was at the window before the echo of it faded. There were 4 shapes moving across the yard in a loose spread. They were confident, not careless, but confident, which meant they expected this to be straightforward. A frightened man, a desperate situation, an isolated homestead. That was what they expected. What they got was Helena Barrett coming out the back door of the cabin with the rifle, moving along the back wall in the dark, with a patience and quietness that suggested she had thought about exactly this moment and walked it through in her head more than once. Ethan took the front, she took the back. They discussed it in the cool, factual language they used for plans, sitting at the table 2 days ago, and he'd listened and understood and done his part without questioning the allocation of roles. The confrontation was short and brutal, and not the least bit elegant. 2 of the men turned and ran when the rifle spoke from a direction they hadn't expected, from behind them, cutting off the retreat toward the east fence. One went down with a wound to the leg that Ethan put there from the front window, firing at a muzzle flash when the man raised his own weapon toward the cabin wall. The 4th man, the one closest to the cabin door, the one who'd been designated to go through it first, froze when Helena's voice came from 6 feet behind him in the dark, and said, with a conversational steadiness that Ethan would think about for a long time afterward, "Put it down, or I'll put you down, and I promise you I shoot better in the dark than most men do in daylight." He put it down. They had 1 prisoner, 1 wounded man who'd crawled to the east fence and made enough noise doing it that Ethan found him without much difficulty. 2 gone into the dark who wouldn't be coming back. Not tonight. Because whatever they'd been paid for this particular job didn't include the possibility of being shot at by a woman who shot like she meant it. The prisoner's name was Cole Deakins, and he was 23 years old, and he was scared in the way that young men who've made a bad decision are scared, completely, physically, with no reserves left for pride. He sat in Ethan's kitchen chair with his wrist tied to it and his hat on the floor and his eyes moving between Ethan and Helena with the calculation of someone trying to figure out which one was in charge. He landed, eventually, on Helena. She sat across from him at the table with the lamp between them, the same position she used for her accounting work. The ledger closed in front of her, and she looked at Cole Deakins with the same steady, assessing attention she turned on everything she needed to understand. "You're going to tell me who hired you," she said. "Not because I'm going to threaten you, but because you're 23 years old, and the man who hired you just sent you into a situation where 2 of your partners ran away, and one of them is lying in a field bleeding. That's what he thought your life was worth." Deacon's jaw worked. He looked at the table. "Crowley's done this before," she said. It was a statement, not a question. She was watching his face. Something shifted in his expression. The small, involuntary flicker of recognition that a name produces when it's the right name. He hadn't said anything. He didn't have to. "He's done this to other ranches," she said. "How many?" Deakins looked up at her. He was doing a calculation. She could see it. Weighing what he owed Crowley against what the next 10 years of his life looked like if he kept his mouth shut for a man who'd just demonstrated exactly what he thought of the men who worked for him. 3. Deacon said finally. His voice was rough. That I know of. Probably more. What happens to the ranchers? They take the offer or they leave. Nobody got killed. He said it with the particular emphasis of someone who needs that to be true. Crowley doesn't, he's not that kind of, he sent 4 armed men to a homestead in the middle of the night, Ethan said from the corner. He'd been quiet through this, letting Helena work, which was the right thing to do, and he knew it, but there were limits. Deacons didn't answer that. What's the next step? Helena said. What did he tell you would happen if tonight didn't work? Deacon's eyes dropped to the table again. When he spoke, his voice was low and had something in it that Ethan recognized after a moment as genuine reluctance. Not loyalty, but something closer to shame. Bigger crew, he said. He said bigger crew and no more. No more warning shots. He said he needed that land cleared and recorded in his name before the spring survey. The spring survey. Helena's pencil appeared in her hand without her seeming to pick it up, and she wrote 2 words in the ledger. Spring survey. Why the spring survey? Ethan asked. Railroad, Deacon said. There's a railroad survey coming through in the spring. The route goes through the north end of this county. Land along the route. He stopped, swallowed. Land along the route is worth 4 or 5 times what it is now, maybe more. The room went absolutely quiet. Ethan looked at Helena. Helena was looking at the 2 words she'd written, and her expression had the quality of someone who has just found the last piece of a puzzle they've been working on for weeks. Not triumphant, not satisfied, because satisfaction comes later. Right now, just the recognition, clean and sharp. The North Pasture. Crowley's specific, persistent interest in the North Pasture. The land along the survey route. The accelerated timeline. The escalating methods. The barn fire. All of it collapsed into a single clear picture in about 4 seconds. He needs the land before the survey is public, Helena said. Not to Deacons. To herself, really. To the ledger. Once the road is announced, the price goes up and the original owner's legal standing to reclaim it becomes much harder to challenge. She looked at Cole Deacons, who was watching her with the expression of a man who just understood he'd been used as a disposable piece in something considerably larger than he'd been told. You're going to write down everything you just told me, she said, signed and dated. I'm going to send it to a lawyer in Laramie along with the financial documentation I've already prepared. She paused. In return, I'm going to ask the sheriff to treat you as a witness rather than a primary suspect. I can't make promises for the law, but I can make sure the law knows you cooperated. She looked at him steadily. Or you can refuse, and we hand you to the sheriff in the morning as a man who came to this property armed with 3 others, one of whom injured someone. And Crowley will let you sit in the Bitter Ridge jail for as long as it takes for you to stop being useful to him. Deacon stared at her. Who are you? He said. It came out almost involuntary, not quite accusatory, genuinely asking. Helena picked up the pencil and held it out to him. Someone who read the numbers, she said. Write it down. He wrote it down. Ethan sat on the front steps of the cabin when it was over, in the cold before dawn, with the ruins of the barn still faintly visible in the dark, and the smell of old smoke hanging in the air. His hands ached where the blisters had pulled. His back ached from the hours of tension. He was tired in a way that went down to the bone. Helena came out and sat beside him, which surprised him because she didn't usually seek proximity. She sat with her coat pulled around her and her ledger on her lap, but she wasn't writing in it. She was just sitting. Railroad, he said after a while. Railroad, she agreed. All this time it wasn't about cattle or the water or... It was always about the land, she said. The cattle and the water were just the tools he used to lower the price. Make a man desperate enough, and he sells cheap. She was quiet. He's patient. He probably started this 2 years ago, right around when the preliminary survey conversations would have started in Cheyenne. And now he knows we know. Yes. So the bigger crew Deacons mentioned is a real possibility, she said. Yes. They sat in the dark and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that a signed statement from Cole Deacons and a collection of financial discrepancies, however well organized, did not stop armed men from arriving in the night. The law in this part of Wyoming moved slowly and carefully and with great respect for men who had money and connections in Cheyenne. Arthur Keene in Laramie moved slowly. The Territorial Banking Office moved slowly. Crowley, when frightened, had demonstrated that he moved fast. "We could go to Walt Gruber," Ethan said. "He's got men, and he's—" "We could," Helena said. "And Walt Gruber would help, and we'd owe Walt Gruber something afterward that changes the shape of this ranch's independence going forward." She wasn't dismissing it. She was just laying it out. "Or we use what we have here and hold the ground ourselves long enough for the law to catch up." Ethan looked at her profile in the dark, the square set of her jaw, the particular stillness she held when she was thinking hardest. "Do you know how to do that?" he asked. "Hold ground. Against men with guns." She was quiet for a moment. "I know how numbers work," she said, "and ground holding is mostly about numbers. How many approaches? How many angles? How long a man has to cross open ground before he becomes a problem." She paused. "I worked it out in my head the first week I was here, before the barn fire." Ethan absorbed this. He looked out at the dark yard and the ruined barn and the east pasture where the new well sat 11 feet down in the earth, water that had been there the whole time. "You were planning for this before we even knew about Crowley for certain," he said. "I was planning for what the numbers suggested was possible," she said. "The numbers suggested this was possible." He thought about asking her again if she was all right, but this time he read the moment correctly and understood it wasn't the right question. Instead he said, "Tell me the plan." She opened the ledger. In the dark, she couldn't read what she'd written, but she probably didn't need to. "We have 3 days before he responds," she said. "Maybe 4. Here's what we do with them." And she told him quietly, in the dark before dawn with the cold Wyoming air around them and the smell of burned timber still heavy in it. And he listened to every word, and by the time the sun started to lift itself over the eastern ridge, he understood exactly what they were going to do and why it had a chance of working. Whether it would be enough was a different question entirely, and neither of them said it out loud. The 3 days Helena had estimated turned into 2, which told them that Deakins had been wrong about the timeline, or that Crowley was more rattled than his patience usually allowed. Either way, when Walt Gruber's youngest hand came riding hard down the north road on the second afternoon with dust coming off his horse and sheets, Ethan was already in the yard reinforcing the gatepost, and he read the urgency in the rider's posture before the boy even opened his mouth. 7 men, the boy said, pulling up hard. "Maybe 8, coming from Crowley's south range. Walt saw them from the ridge this morning. They're not moving fast, but they're moving steady, and they're armed like they mean it." Ethan looked at the boy and then at the cabin where Helena was working, and he called her name once, not loud, just enough. She came out with the ledger under her arm out of pure habit, realized she didn't need it, set it inside the door, and came the rest of the way into the yard. The boy told it again, shorter this time, because she listened in a way that extracted information efficiently without requiring repetition. "When?" she said. "Walt figures dawn tomorrow. They camped near the Bitter Creek crossing last night." She nodded. "Thank Walt for me. Tell him we're all right and we don't need his men." She said the second part with a particular emphasis that made Ethan look at her sideways, because Walt Gruber had offered twice and she'd declined twice, and now she was declining a third time she hadn't even been offered yet. The boy looked uncertain. "He said to say the offer stands." "Tell him I know," Helena said, "and tell him to keep his men on his own land tonight. It'll matter later that he wasn't involved." She looked at the boy directly. "Can you remember that exact wording?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Ride safe." After he left, Ethan stood in the yard and looked at her and said, "You want to explain that last part?" "If Walt's men are here when this happens, whatever legal case we're building gets complicated," she said, already moving toward the cabin. "Crowley's lawyers will call it a range war between competing operations and muddy the water. If it's just the 2 of us defending our own land against armed trespassers, it's simpler." She went inside. He followed. "Also, I don't want anyone else hurt for our problem. Helena, there are 7 or 8 of them." "I know how many there are." She pulled the rough map she'd drawn of the homestead from under the ledger and spread it on the table. "Sit down. We have work to do tonight." He sat down. She had spent the 2 previous days doing things he'd understood individually but hadn't fully assembled into a coherent picture until now, watching her explain it with the pencil moving across the hand-drawn map. She'd moved the cattle to the far south pasture, all 11 of them, which served 2 purposes: kept them away from the probable action and consolidated them somewhere accessible for a quick count afterward, because she was already thinking about afterward with the same clarity she thought about right now. She'd reinforced the cabin's 2 window shutters with extra timber, not enough to stop a determined assault, but enough to change the risk calculation for a man thinking about coming through a window. She'd pulled water from the new east well and stored it in every container the cabin had, in case they needed to stay inside for an extended period. She'd also, on the first day, ridden to Bitter Ridge alone. He'd thought she was going to the post office, which she was, partly, and had a conversation with the telegraph operator that she hadn't told him about until now. "I sent a telegraph to Arthur Keene in Laramie," she said, "and one to the territorial sheriff's office in Cheyenne." Ethan stared at her. "You telegraphed the sheriff's office? What did you say?" "I told them that the Mercer homestead outside Bitter Ridge was subject to a documented pattern of financial fraud orchestrated by a named party, that we had a signed witness statement and documentary evidence, and that credible threats of imminent violence had been made against the property." She looked at him with the steady eyes she used when she needed him to follow something precisely. "I gave them Deakins' statement by summary and told them the original was with Arthur Keene. I told them we expected armed men on our property within 48 hours. That was 2 days ago." "Yes. And nobody came." "The territorial sheriff's office moves slowly," she said, "but it moves. They've now been formally notified. If something happens here tonight, there is a record that we told them it was coming, who we said was responsible, and what evidence we had." She paused. "Crowley can buy influence, but he can't buy a telegraph record that's been sitting in the Cheyenne office for 2 days before anyone was hurt." Ethan absorbed this quietly. She'd been building a paper trail the way a hunter builds a blind. Not dramatically, not obviously, piece by piece from the moment she'd sat down at his table with his account ledger and a cup of cold coffee. "You've been 3 steps ahead of this the whole time," he said. She looked down at the map. 2 steps, she said. Sometimes only 1. She traced the north approach on the paper with her pencil. "Tonight I'm genuinely working with what I have, which is less than I'd like." It was again one of those small moments of honesty that she offered without softening them, and he'd learned by now to receive them for what they were. Not weakness, not doubt, just the truth stated plainly by someone who respected him enough to tell it. "Show me what we're doing," he said. She'd identified 3 things that worked in their favor. The homestead sat in a natural depression on the north and east sides, which meant any approach from those directions required coming downhill into the yard, crossing open ground without cover for the last 50 yards. The cabin itself was solid timber, which meant it could absorb a considerable amount of attention without structurally failing. And the new well in the east pasture sat behind a low berm of excavated earth that was, by accident of its construction, a reasonable defensive position covering the east fence line. What worked against them was the obvious arithmetic. 2 people against 7 or 8, in the dark, on ground that the attackers had presumably scouted. "They're going to split," Helena said. "North approach and east approach simultaneously, or north and west. They want to push us into a crossfire, so we don't stay in the crossfire." "Where do we stay?" She pointed to the map. "You take the cabin, front window, northeast angle. That covers the north approach and the yard gate. You don't move from there unless the cabin is actually on fire." She said it without irony, though the ghost of it was there, given what had happened to the barn. "I take the east berm. It's 40 yards from the house, which means I'm outside whatever they're expecting, and it covers the east fence from a position they'll assume is empty." Ethan looked at the distance between the cabin mark and the east berm mark on the map. 40 yards. In the dark. With 7 armed men moving between them. "I don't like you being out there alone," he said. "I know," she said. She didn't say it dismissively. She said it like she'd considered it too and come to a different conclusion. "But the position works. And I shoot straight." He knew she shot straight. He'd watched her with the rifle on the night of the first attack with the kind of attention you pay to something that surprises you. And the thing that had surprised him wasn't that she could shoot. It was the quality of her stillness. She didn't shake. She didn't hesitate. She made decisions with the rifle the way she made decisions with the ledger, quickly and without second-guessing herself, and she committed to them completely. "There's something else," she said. "Of course there is. I want to try to take Crowley." She held up one hand before he could speak. "Not capture him. I mean, I want him on the property when this happens. In the open, seen, identifiable." Ethan looked at her. "How?" "He'll come," she said. Men like Crowley come to the end of things they've been working on for 2 years. They need to see it finish. He'll stay back, stay at the edge, but he'll come. She met Ethan's eyes. If he's on this property after sundown with 7 armed men and we can document it, his horse, his presence, anything, his lawyers lose half their argument before they open their mouths. How do we document it? We'll be occupied. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Walt Gruber's boy, the one who rides for him. I need him on the south ridge at dawn with a clear line of sight to the north road. Just watching, just seeing who's there and being able to say so later. Ethan thought about it. That puts the boy in proximity to, he watches from the ridge. He doesn't come down. He doesn't engage. He's a witness, not a participant. She looked at Ethan steadily. It's his choice to make, but he should have the choice. Ethan nodded slowly. I'll ride to Walt's tonight. Go before dark, she said. Be back before midnight. I was back by 10. The boy, his name was Thomas, 17, serious in the way of young men who want to prove something, had agreed without hesitation, which made Ethan feel both reassured and vaguely guilty. And Walt Gruber had stood in his yard with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long count, and then said, You tell that wife of yours that whatever she's doing it right. Which was about as much as Walt Gruber ever said about anything. The night was clear and brutally cold, the kind of Wyoming October cold that made the stars look sharp and close. And Ethan came back to the homestead and found Helena in the yard checking the tin can wire along the east fence, adjusting the tension with the systematic thoroughness she brought to everything. They ate something. Neither of them remembered afterward what it was exactly, something simple and quick. And they checked the rifles and the ammunition, and Helena sat at the table for 20 minutes with the ledger and wrote something he didn't read, and then she closed it and put it inside the lining of her travel bag with the other documents, and put the bag under the floorboard where he kept the tin box, and she covered it with the loose board and the rag rug. If something happens to me, she said, Helena, I need you to hear this. She wasn't dramatic about it. She was just clear. If something happens to me, the bag is under the board. Everything's there, organized by category. Arthur Keene knows what to do with it. He looked at her across the cabin in the lamplight. She looked back at him with the same clear, direct attention she always had, and he thought about the platform at Bitter Ridge 42 days ago, and the wilted flowers, and the blurry photograph, and the man he'd been when he stood there, how small and specific his expectations had been, how completely insufficient they'd turned out to be as a frame for Helena Barrett. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said. Probably not, she agreed, but I needed to say it anyway. He nodded. She picked up the rifle and checked the load and set it by the door, and they sat in the cabin without talking for a while. And outside the Wyoming dark was very complete and very quiet. At 2 a.m, Helena said, Get some sleep. I'll watch till 4. He started to argue and then looked at her and understood. It was not a suggestion he was going to win, and he lay down on the bed in his clothes and closed his eyes and was asleep faster than he expected, because his body had made the practical decision independently of his mind. She woke him at 4. She'd made coffee, which told him nothing had happened yet, and she'd been up all 2 hours because the coffee was fresh. They traded without talking. He sat at the front window and she lay down, and he watched the dark yard and the north fence line and the stars turning slowly overhead, and thought about railroad surveys and north pastures and the specific patience of a man who had decided 2 years ago to dismantle someone else's life piece by quiet piece. They came at first light, not dawn, exactly. The sky was still more gray than gold when Ethan heard the horses on the north road, enough of them to have a specific sound, a weight of hooves that was different from 1 or 2 animals moving. He put his hand on Helena's shoulder, and she was awake before the pressure fully registered, sitting up in the same motion, reaching for the rifle. North Road, he said quietly. She was already at the east door. She stopped with her hand on the latch and looked back at him for a moment. He looked at her. There was nothing theatrical about it. No dramatic pause, no words that would sound significant in retrospect. She just looked at him with her clear dark eyes, and he looked back, and then she went out the east door low and fast, and he went to the front window. 8 men. He counted them as they came over the north rise and down the slope toward the homestead fence. 8 men on horseback, moving in a loose spread that suggested someone had organized them with at least basic tactical sense. not bunched together, spread wide enough to cover the yard from multiple angles, a formation designed to overwhelm a single defender quickly. And behind them, hanging back at the top of the rise, sitting on a big gray horse that Ethan recognized from the platform at Bitter Ridge 2 months ago, Silas Crowley. He'd come. Helena had been right. Ethan pulled back from the window, controlled the tight thing in his chest that wanted to become panic and didn't let it, and focused on the front yard the way she'd told him to focus. North approach. Yard gate. Northeast angle. Hold the cabin. The lead rider came through the gate first, pushing it open rather than going around it, which told Ethan something about how seriously they were taking the possibility of resistance. They didn't expect much. They'd heard about the barn, about the first crew running off, and maybe Deacons had fed them a version of what happened that was shorter on detail than the truth, because they were moving with a confidence that didn't match 8 men coming to take a defended position. That confidence lasted right up until Helena's rifle spoke from the east berm. She didn't aim to kill. That was something he understood later, thinking about it. She aimed to disrupt, to change the shape of what these men thought they were walking into. The shot took the hat off the lead rider, close enough that the man's horse spooked sideways hard and nearly threw him, and in the half-second of chaos that followed, the formation scattered exactly the way she'd predicted it would. The men in the rear pulling up, the men in the middle trying to find the source of the shot, the lead rider fighting his horse, and nobody, for that crucial moment, doing what they'd come to do. Ethan shot from the front window into the ground, 6 feet in front of the rightmost rider, close enough to make his point without making a corpse, and called out through the window, "This is private property. You are trespassing. Identify your employer and your purpose, or leave this land now." He'd rehearsed those words. Helena had suggested them. Not a threat. A demand for identification, spoken loudly, in a form that would be repeated accurately by anyone who heard it. One of the men shouted something back that wasn't compliance. 2 of them were trying to flank right, moving toward the east fence, which put them directly in Helena's field of fire from the berm, and she made that point with a second shot that hit the fence post between the 2 men with enough accuracy that both of them pulled up hard. This was not what they had expected. The man who seemed to be leading the group, a broad-shouldered man on a black horse who'd come in second through the gate, was pulling his own rifle and scanning for Helena's position on the berm, and Ethan took a breath and put a round into the dirt 2 feet from the black horse's front hooves, and the horse went sideways and the man lost the rifle entirely trying to stay on the animal. 7 seconds had passed. In those 7 seconds, the 8 men who'd come down that hill in a formation designed to overwhelm a single frightened rancher had lost their shape, their confidence, and their lead man's rifle. And the source of the fire from the east was still unclear enough that 3 of them were scanning the wrong direction. "I said identify your employer," Ethan called again, louder. "Last time I'll ask it." The broad-shouldered man got his horse under control and looked at the cabin and then looked toward where Crowley was sitting on the gray horse at the top of the rise. It was a visible look, a checking-in look, the look of a man who needed direction from the person who'd sent him here. And Ethan watched it happen and thought, "You just gave me something." On the south ridge, Thomas Gruber, 17 years old and serious about it, was watching everything with eyes that would remember every detail for a very long time. Crowley didn't ride down. He sat on the gray horse at the top of the rise and looked at the yard and at the 2 rifle positions and at his 8 men in various states of disorder. And even at this distance, Ethan could see the calculation happening, the reassessment, the sudden unwelcome arithmetic of a situation that had stopped looking like a sure thing and started looking like a problem. He made a motion with his hand, brief, almost casual. The broad-shouldered man looked at it, and then at the cabin, and then made a decision that Ethan suspected was one of the better decisions of his professional career. He turned his horse toward the gate. "Let's go," he said to the others. Not loudly, not elaborately, just that. 2 of them looked uncertain. One of them, the one who'd lost his rifle, looked actively relieved. They turned. They went back through the gate and up the north rise, not running, because men like this didn't run, but not slow either. And they moved with the particular quality of motion that belongs to people who've made a decision and are committed to it. Crowley watched them come. He sat there until they reached him at the top of the rise, and there was a brief exchange that Ethan couldn't hear, and then the group turned north. Except Crowley didn't turn with them right away. He sat for a moment longer on the gray horse at the top of the rise, looking down at the homestead, and Ethan looked back at him through the window across 200 yards of Wyoming morning, and neither of them moved. Then Helena stepped out from behind the east berm. She walked into the open yard and stood there with the rifle in her hands, not raised, just held, and she looked up the rise at Crowley the same way she'd looked at Randall Fitch across a bank desk and at Cole Deakins across the kitchen table, directly, steadily, with no particular emotion showing and absolutely nothing yielding. Crowley looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode north. The shaking came for Ethan about 20 minutes later, which was when the adrenaline finished burning off and left him standing in the yard with his legs uncertain under him and his hands doing something independently of his intentions. He sat down on the water trough because it was there, and he sat there and breathed and waited for it to pass. Helena came across the yard from the berm and sat down next to him on the trough. Not close, but next to him. She had dirt on her coat from lying on the berm, and her hair had come loose on one side, and she looked like someone who'd been in the cold for 3 hours, which she had. She didn't say anything about the shaking, she just sat there. After a while, Ethan said, "Nobody got killed." "No," she said. "That was—" He stopped, started again. "What you did out there, reading where they'd push, setting the position. It worked because of the terrain," she said, "and because they weren't expecting 2 positions. If they'd scouted better—" "Helena." He waited until she looked at him. "It worked because of you." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, and he saw the thing that moved across her face. Not modesty, not deflection, something more honest than either. Something that looked like a person who'd spent a long time being very capable in situations that required it and wasn't entirely sure what to do with being thanked for it. "Thomas Gruber saw Crowley at the top of the rise," she said. "He'll confirm it. Combined with the men on the property, the documented history, Deakins' statement." She straightened. Came back to the work, because work was what she trusted. "We need to get to Laramie. Arthur Keene needs the full package today, not by letter. Today, in person. I'll get the horses from Waltz. How fast can we make Laramie?" "Hard riding? 5-6 hours." She stood up. "Then we should leave by 8. She looked at him one more time, and something in her expression was different from how it had been before the morning, subtly, in a way he couldn't name precisely. A loosening, maybe. The smallest degree. "Are you all right?" He thought about it honestly. His hands had stopped their independence. His legs felt solid again. The burned-out shell of his barn was visible past the east fence, and the yard had hoofprints in it that weren't his. And he was sitting on the edge of a water trough in the cold October morning on land that people had been trying to take from him for 2 years. "Yeah," he said. "I think I actually am." Arthur Keene was 61 years old, white-haired, and moved slowly in the way of a man who'd stopped being in a hurry once he'd accumulated enough experience to know that most things requiring haste had been given insufficient thought. He had an office on the second floor of a building on Main Street in Laramie, and he opened his door to Ethan and Helena at 2:30 in the afternoon with the expression of a man who had been expecting something but not quite this. He looked at Helena first, shook her hand, said, "Mrs. Mercer, your telegraph was very well written," which was, coming from Keene, high praise. They sat in his office, and Helena laid the documentation on his desk in the sequence she'd organized it, explaining each piece as she set it down, and Keene read it with the thoroughness of an old man who'd stopped performing thoroughness and just did it. He asked 3 questions in 40 minutes. The questions were very good, which meant he'd understood everything and was only asking about the places that needed reinforcing. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the documents on his desk and said, "You built this in how long?" 6 weeks, Helena said. He looked at her with something that was more than professional respect. "You have a legal background, Mrs. Mercer." "I have a mathematics background," she said, "and 6 weeks of motivation." He almost smiled. The railroad angle changes the nature of the case. Fraud to acquire land along a surveyed railroad route isn't just a civil matter. It crosses into federal jurisdiction, depending on the land grant provisions. He straightened the documents. "I'm going to need to make 2 inquiries before we file. One to the Territorial Land Office and one to the Federal Surveyor's Office in Denver, both to establish the route on the record before Crowley can take steps to obscure it." He looked at Ethan. "This may move faster than you expect once it starts, or it may take months. I won't know which until I make those inquiries." How fast can you make them? Helena said. Telegraph today. Response probably 2 to 3 days. He paused. In the meantime, I'd suggest you both stay in Laramie. Ethan started to say something about the cattle and the land, and Helena put her hand briefly on his arm. Just briefly, just enough. And he stopped. We'll stay, she said. They found rooms at a boarding house 2 streets over, and Ethan paid for them with $40 of the remaining $82 in the tin box, which 3 months ago would have felt like bleeding, and which now felt like the most reasonable expenditure he could imagine. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the boarding house room that evening and thought about the homestead sitting empty on the Bitter Ridge Road, the new well in the east pasture, and the ruined barn, and the 4 chickens in the reorganized coop, and the south pasture that was resting now against the spring the way Helena said it should rest. He thought about Crowley turning his horse at the top of the rise. The flat, assessing look of a man who had miscalculated something significant and knew it. He thought about Helena standing in the open yard with the rifle held loose at her side, looking up the hill. There was a knock at his door. He opened it. Helena was there, still in her traveling clothes, with her ledger, because she always had her ledger. Keene wants us back at 9 tomorrow morning, she said. He's already drafted 2 of the inquiries. He works fast. He works the right speed, she said, which was a distinction she apparently cared about. She looked at him, and then at the floor, and then back at him, and there was something slightly different in the manner of it, less the deliberate consideration of every word, and more something quieter, less managed. You should eat something, she said. There's a diner on the corner. I know, he said. I've been to Laramie before. I know you have. She held the ledger in both hands. I thought we could eat together. It was, from Helena Barrett, approximately equivalent to a declaration. He understood that, the way he'd learned to understand most things about her. Not by what she said explicitly, but by the specific weight she gave to things she said simply. Yeah, he said. All right. They went downstairs and out into the Laramie evening, and they walked to the diner on the corner, and they ordered food and ate it while it was still hot, which was an improvement over most of their meals at the homestead, and they talked about Keene's timeline and what they'd need to do if the federal jurisdiction angle held, and somewhere in the middle of it, they also talked about other things. About Helena's 3 summers in Ohio and why she'd left, about Ethan's father and the way the ranch had been in better years, about the specific stubbornness required to stay on Wyoming land through a bad winter when every reasonable voice said to go somewhere easier. It wasn't until they were walking back that Ethan realized they'd been talking for 2 hours, and he couldn't remember the last time 2 hours had passed that quickly or that easily. He didn't say that out loud. He thought about saying it and then decided it didn't need to be said right now. There would be time. It was increasingly certain of that, and the certainty felt like a new kind of weight to carry, not the crushing kind, not the kind that kept him awake staring at water stains on the ceiling, but the kind that a man puts in his chest and learns to walk upright with. Arthur Keene's responses from Denver and the Territorial Land Office arrived in 41 hours, which was faster than anyone had predicted. When they came into his office on the second morning, he was already reading them, and the expression on his face when he looked up was the expression of a man who has found exactly what he suspected was there and is now deciding the most efficient way to use it. The railroad route, he said, was registered with the Federal Surveyor's Office 14 months ago, which means Crowley has known about it for at least 14 months. He set the papers down. It also means that any acquisition of land along the route during that period, obtained through documented fraud, constitutes interference with a federal land grant process. He looked at Helena. You were right about the jurisdiction. Helena said nothing. She just opened the ledger to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. What happens now? Ethan asked. Now, Keene said, I file in Cheyenne, and I send a courtesy notice to the federal office in Denver. He paused. And Silas Crowley is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with his lawyers within about a week of that filing, because they're going to tell him something he doesn't want to hear. What's that? Ethan said. Keene looked at him over the desk with the calm of a man who had practiced law for 35 years and had learned to take satisfaction in precise moments. That the woman he called an angle worker from the catalog, he said, just outflanked him in 3 jurisdictions simultaneously. Helena did not smile exactly, but something in the set of her mouth changed, and Ethan saw it, and it was enough. Keene filed in Cheyenne on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, Crowley's lawyers had responded with a motion to dismiss on procedural grounds, which Keene described to Ethan and Helena as the legal equivalent of a man throwing his hat in front of a runaway wagon. He said it without particular satisfaction, just as an assessment. The motion would fail. It was designed to slow things down, not to win anything, and a man only slowed things down when he was trying to move something else into position while the law wasn't looking. They stayed in Laramie. It cost money Ethan didn't have in great abundance, but Keene had advanced the legal costs against the eventual settlement on the fraud claim, which was either generous or calculated or both. And the boarding house was reasonable, and Helena had, within the first 4 days, found work tutoring the boarding house owner's 2 daughters in arithmetic for 2 hours each afternoon, which covered their meals and left a small remainder. Ethan had watched her negotiate that arrangement with the boarding house owner, a Mrs. Prentice, with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything, and Mrs. Prentice had agreed before she'd fully understood she was agreeing, and the girls had taken to Helena with the straightforward devotion that children extend to adults who treat them as capable of understanding things rather than as small vessels to be filled slowly. He'd sat at the small table in the boarding house parlor one afternoon and watched Helena explain a column of figures to the older girl. She was 12, serious, wanted to understand, and there was something in the way Helena taught that was different from the way she explained things to Ethan, gentler without being condescending, and he'd sat with his coffee going cold and felt something turn over in him quietly. He didn't examine it right then. There were other things to examine right then. The federal response came on the 9th day. The letter arrived at Keene's office addressed to Arthur Keene, attorney at law, on behalf of Ethan and Helena Mercer, and Keene read it standing at his desk before they'd finished sitting down. His face during the reading was professionally neutral in the way that old lawyers' faces were, and then he set it down and looked at them both and said, "The Federal Land Office is opening a formal inquiry into land acquisitions along the preliminary railroad survey route in Cotter County, which is the county that includes Bitter Ridge." Helena said, "Which ranches?" "All of them acquired in the last 18 months, Keene said, which is 7 properties besides yours. 5 of them now registered under holding companies that trace back through 2 layers of paper to Crowley's operation." He sat down. "The federal inquiry means the territorial case I filed gets superseded by a larger jurisdiction, which is better for you and significantly worse for him." Ethan looked at the letter on Keene's desk. 7 properties. 7 ranches, 7 families or men who'd thought they were failing through their own insufficiency, who'd taken Crowley's offer or abandoned their claims and moved on, and not one of them had known it was engineered. Not one of them had had someone sit down at their table at night and look at the numbers clearly enough to see what the numbers were actually saying. He thought about that for a long time without saying it. "What happens to the 7 ranches?" Helena said. Keene looked at her with a slight pause that meant the question had required him to consider something. "The federal process will attempt to identify the original owners and the nature of the acquisitions. If fraud is established, and the documentation you provided gives them considerable material to work with, there are remedies available. Restitution, reversal of title in some cases." He paused. "It will be complicated and slow, and some of those ranchers have moved on too completely to make return practical, but some of them will get something back." Helena nodded. She was writing in the ledger. She was always writing in the ledger. Ethan said, "And Crowley?" "Crowley is currently in a conversation with his lawyers that I expect is extremely expensive and not particularly encouraging." Keene folded his hands on the desk. "The federal fraud charge, if it sticks, carries penalties that go beyond fines. He's a wealthy man with connections, and that will protect him to a degree. But the railroad company has its own lawyers and its own interest in not having its survey route tangled up in fraud proceedings, and railroad lawyers in 1884 are not less formidable than any other kind." He looked at Ethan. "He won't come out of this intact, that much I can tell you." Ethan sat with that. 2 months ago, he'd been standing on a platform in Bitter Ridge watching Crowley smile and unable to do anything about it. Now the man was in a room somewhere with expensive lawyers delivering expensive bad news, and the thread that had unraveled all of it had started with a woman looking at a column of numbers and writing a question in the margin. "Can we go home?" he said. Keene looked at him. "I'd recommend staying through the initial federal response. Another 2 weeks, perhaps 3. 3 weeks? Ethan said, less to Keene than to himself. 3 weeks more of the boarding house and the cold coffee and the narrow bed and the 2 hours walking distance from everything he'd spent his adult life building. Helena said, without looking up from the ledger, "The South Pasture will be all right for 3 weeks." He looked at her. "I know you're thinking about it," she said, still writing. "The rotation I set up will hold through the end of the month without intervention. The east well is reliable. The chickens have enough feed through mid-November." She looked up at him. 3 weeks won't break it." It was such a specific, practical kind of reassurance. She knew exactly which worries lived in him and addressed them by name, without sentiment, without softening them into something false. He'd come to rely on that, he realized, more than he'd noticed himself doing it. 3 weeks, he said. "All right." Crowley broke on the 14th day. Not publicly, not dramatically. The breaking of men with money and lawyers never looked dramatic from the outside. What happened was that Keene received a communication from Crowley's legal representation requesting a settlement conversation, which Keene described to them that evening over coffee in his office as the moment a man decides that controlling the terms of his defeat is preferable to having the terms decided for him. Helena said, "What does he want?" "To settle the fraud claim against the Mercer homestead directly, in exchange for a reduction of his cooperation with the federal inquiry." Keene set down his cup. "His lawyers are proposing full restitution of the fraudulent interest overcharges, correction of the livestock weight records with compensatory payment, and withdrawal of all pressure on the loan." Ethan said, "That's what he owes us. That's just paying what he owes us." "Yes," Keene said, "which is why I told them that wasn't a settlement, that was a starting position, and that Mrs. Mercer would be communicating her terms directly." He looked at Helena with something between professional admiration and personal amusement. "I hope that was all right." Helena looked at him for a moment. "You want me to write the terms?" "I want you to write the terms," Keene said, "because in 35 years of practice, I have never seen documentation built this cleanly in 6 weeks by someone without a law degree, and I expect your terms will be equally precise." There was a silence in the office that had a particular quality, the quality of a moment that several things have been building toward, and that arrives more quietly than expected. Helena opened the ledger to a clean page. "Tell me what's enforceable," she said. They worked for 2 hours. The terms she wrote were not vindictive and not soft, which was, Ethan thought watching her, entirely characteristic. She wasn't interested in punishing Crowley beyond what the situation required. She was interested in making the situation right, which was a different thing and a harder thing, because punishment had a clear shape, and making things right was complicated and irregular, and involved 7 ranches and 5 families and years of accumulated damage. She wrote it all in. Not just the Mercer claim, the documentation she'd provided to the federal inquiry, the witness statement from Deacons, the evidence of the pattern across all 7 properties. She wrote a requirement that Crowley's cooperation with the federal inquiry be full and unobstructed as a condition of the reduced private settlement. She wrote it carefully, with Keene checking each clause, and when she was done, she handed the page to Keene, and he read it and said, "This will hold." "It needs to hold," she said. Crowley's lawyers came back in 3 days with counter-proposals on 2 clauses. Helena changed 1 word in 1 clause and held firm on everything else. They accepted. The signing happened in Keene's office on a Wednesday morning in early November, with a territorial notary present and Keene and Ethan and Helena on one side of the desk and 2 of Crowley's lawyers on the other. Crowley himself was not present, which told Ethan something about the man, that he could send proxies for the building of plans but couldn't sit across a desk for the accounting of them. Helena signed her name in her precise, legible hand. Ethan signed beside it. The notary stamped and dated. It was in the end just paper and ink and 2 signatures. But there was a particular weight to it, the weight of 63 days of work and 2 years of someone else's patient damage being named and answered for. And Ethan sat in Keene's office after the lawyers had gone and felt it settle over him like something had been set down. Helena was already putting the ledger in her bag. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. He didn't have words that were adequate to the situation, so he said the honest thing, which was inadequate but true. "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment with the clear, direct attention that was so particularly hers, and then she said, "You kept the land worth fighting for. That matters too." It was generous. He wasn't entirely sure it was accurate, but he received it. They went home on a Friday, which was 67 days after Helena Barrett had stepped off the train at Bitter Ridge with her leather ledger and her wilted flowers and her surveyor's eyes. The ride back from Laramie took most of the day, the horses easy on the road, the November cold sharp and clean in a way that felt different from the October cold before everything had broken open, thinner somehow, less weighted with what was coming. The homestead looked the same. Of course it did. 67 days of legal proceedings in Laramie left no visible marks on fence posts and cabin walls, and the south pasture was, as Helena had predicted, exactly as she'd left it. The 4 chickens were alive and irritable in the reorganized coop. The east well was full and clear. The ruined barn was still a ruined barn, which was the one thing the settlement hadn't fixed and wouldn't fix directly, because some things you had to rebuild yourself. Ethan stood in the yard in the late afternoon light and looked at all of it. The things that needed doing, the things that had changed, the things that were better than they'd been, and the things that were still broken, and felt the particular complex feeling of a man who has survived something and come back to the place where it happened. Helena went inside and made coffee, and he heard her moving around in the cabin, the specific domestic sounds of her unpacking and reorganizing, and immediately identifying the 3 things that needed attention. And something in those ordinary sounds settled him more than the legal papers and the signatures had. He went in and sat at the table, and she put coffee in front of him, and they sat in the cabin in the early evening with the lamps lit and the cold outside and the smell of the homestead around them, which was wood smoke and hay dust and the specific smell of that kitchen, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Helena said, "The barn." "I know. We can put up a post and beam structure before hard winter if we start Monday. Smaller than what you had, enough for the horses and the hay." "I know how to build a barn," he said. Not defensive, just establishing it. She looked at him. "I know you do." A pause. He drank his coffee. "Walt Gruber offered his crew for a day," he said. "When we were in Laramie, he sent a note through Keene's office." "Did he?" "Said it was what neighbors did." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "He's a good man." "He is." Ethan set his cup down. "The restitution money from the settlement, I want to talk about what to do with it." "Tonight?" "Tonight's fine." She got the ledger. He almost smiled. They worked through it the way they worked through everything. Her writing, him thinking out loud, both of them pushing back on each other's ideas until the ideas were better. The restitution totaled $240 when the interest overcharges and the livestock weight compensation were added together. Against that was the remaining bank debt, which the settlement's interest correction had reduced to $310. The difference was manageable, not comfortable, but manageable, which was a word Ethan hadn't been able to apply to his finances in 2 years. What was left after addressing the debt was $60. $60 was not a cattle operation. It was a start towards one. "Spring calving," Helena said. "If we buy 2 heifers before winter, we're positioned for a calf crop in the spring. Good bloodline animals from the Laramie sale would run $30 each." She wrote the figures, leaves nothing for contingency. "We have the south pasture resting," he said. That's worth something in the spring." "It's worth a lot in the spring," she said. "Rested pasture in May." She wrote another figure. "If we carry 11 cattle through to May on the north section and rest the south until June, the condition of the spring grass should support 20 head," he said, "if the calves come clean." She looked at the figures. 22, with reasonable attrition assumptions. 22 head come fall roundup, sold at Laramie instead of Bitter Ridge. He did the arithmetic himself in his head. He'd always been able to do arithmetic in his head. He'd just spent 2 years doing it on numbers too small to add up to anything. "That's a year," she said. "One good year, managed right, gets you current on everything and positioned for the following spring." One good year. He'd had 2 bad years and a burning barn and a man pulling quiet levers from behind respectable offices. And one good year was not a guarantee and not a promise, and could still be unraveled by drought or disease or bad luck in any of its many available forms. He knew that. She knew that. They both knew that Wyoming didn't negotiate and the land didn't care about your plans. But one good year was possible now. That was different from 2 months ago. "All right," he said, 2 heifers from the Laramie sale." She wrote it down, closed the ledger. Outside, the wind moved through the dark in that particular Wyoming way, vast and impersonal and old. and the cabin held against it the way it always had. Silas Crowley's formal charges were filed by the Federal Land Office in December, 6 weeks after the settlement signing. Ethan read about it in the Laramie newspaper that Walt Gruber brought out to the homestead on one of his visits. Walt had taken to riding by once a week or so, ostensibly for various practical reasons that were only partially convincing, because Walt Gruber had decided he liked Helena and found this easier to express through proximity than through direct statement. The charges covered land fraud across 7 properties, manipulation of livestock exchange records, and interference with federal survey interests. 3 of the 7 affected ranchers had been located and were cooperating with the inquiry. 2 had moved far enough away that their participation was uncertain. 2 had lost enough that there was little practical remedy available to them, even if the law found in their favor, which was the hardest part to sit with, and the part that Helena returned to in conversation more than once in the weeks that followed. Crowley's lawyers entered a complex plea that the newspaper described in language suggesting the proceedings would be long. He was not imprisoned pending the inquiry, which was the reality of how the law treated men of property and connection, and Ethan had been prepared for that, but it still sat badly. He said so one evening, and Helena said that the law moving slowly was not the same as the law not moving, and that the difference between Crowley 6 weeks ago and Crowley now was the difference between a man who owned 7 ranches and a man who was going to spend the next several years accounting for them to people he couldn't buy, and that was not nothing. "It's not justice," Ethan said. "No," she agreed. "It's the closest available thing, which isn't the same." He appreciated that she didn't pretend it was the same. Cole Deakins, whose signed statement had been central to both the federal filing and the Cheyenne territorial case, had left the territory entirely by November, which Ethan heard secondhand through Walt. He didn't know where the young man had gone, and he hoped, without quite being able to explain why, that the leaving had been a beginning for Deakins rather than an end. Some people made a bad decision young enough that the decision didn't define them if they got out from under it in time. 23 was young enough. Possibly. The barn went up in 3 days in late November. Walt's crew and Ethan and a neighbor from the North Road who showed up unrequested on the second morning with a son and a box of nails and a manner that suggested he'd decided this was where he needed to be and wasn't looking for thanks about it. It was smaller than the original, post and beam, solid in the joints and honest in the wood, and it smelled of new timber in the cold air the way new construction always did. Helena worked alongside them. She hauled timber and handed up boards and climbed the frame to fit the ridge beam when the men were struggling with the angle, which produced a silence among Walt's crew that had the particular quality of men recalibrating something they'd assumed without examining it. Nobody said anything about it. They just finished the barn. On the last day of November, they bought 2 heifers at the Laramie sale. Good animals, well-documented bloodlines, sold by a rancher east of Laramie who was expanding his operation and needed to move inventory before winter. Helena had researched the bloodlines beforehand in the way she researched everything, and she negotiated the price with a focused pleasantness that got them both animals for $58, which was $2 under her projected cost, and which she noted in the ledger without making a point of it. Ethan noted it anyway. He was keeping track. Winter on a Wyoming homestead was its own kind of test, separate from all the other tests. It was the test of whether 2 people who had been thrown together by crisis and necessity and the particular logic of a mail-order catalog could exist in the same small space for months, without the pressure of emergency to give them purpose, and whether what remained when the emergency was over was enough to build on, or whether it turned out to have been the emergency all along that had been holding things together. Ethan thought about this in the way that men thought about things they were worried about, obliquely, indirectly, at odd moments when his hands were occupied with something else, and his mind went looking for trouble. What he found, as November turned to December and the snow came down serious and committed, was that the answer was not what he'd feared. The small space of the cabin, which he'd expected to become a pressure once the work slowed down, turned out to accommodate 2 people with more ease than he'd imagined, because it turned out that Helena was genuinely interesting to be in a room with in ways that had nothing to do with what she could accomplish. She read. She had books in her travel bag, 4 of them, not many, but selected with care, and she read in the evenings with the same focused quality she brought to the ledger, and sometimes she said something out loud from whatever she was reading, not inviting discussion necessarily, just sharing a thought, the way people did when they were comfortable enough not to need a response. He found himself responding anyway, which led to conversations that ranged farther than he expected, on topics he hadn't discussed with anyone in years because there had been nobody to discuss them with. She had opinions about things, strong, specific, carefully reasoned opinions, and she held them without aggression, but also without yielding them for social comfort. And disagreeing with her was genuinely engaging rather than fraught, which was rarer than it should have been. She was also, he learned over those months, a person who had silences that weren't empty. There were evenings when neither of them spoke for 2 hours, and it was simply two people in a room, each occupied, each present, and it was comfortable in a way that Ethan didn't have a word for and didn't try to find one. He learned other things. He learned that she'd left Ohio at 26 after a situation she described only briefly, involving a man who had thought her intelligence was charming as a characteristic and discovered it was actually a feature of how she was made, which turned out to be less charming to him in practice. She'd gone to Kansas City for 4 years, keeping books for a trading company, and then the job had ended and she'd written to the Bureau, and the Bureau had sent her Ethan's description. "Why Wyoming?" he asked one evening. The stove was working hard and the wind outside was making its Wyoming declarations about its own importance. She was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant she was deciding how honest to be. He'd learned to read those silences too. "Because it was far enough from everything I'd already tried," she said finally. "And because your description was honest about the difficulties. Most men write to the Bureau describing things as better than they are. You wrote what it actually was." She looked at him over the book she'd set down. "I thought a man who was honest about the difficulties was probably honest in general." "I was desperate," he said. "I know," she said. "That doesn't make the honesty less real." He thought about that. "What did you expect when you came?" "I expected to work," she said. "I expected to be useful. I expected it would be hard and complicated and probably not what either of us imagined." She paused. "I didn't expect—" She stopped. He waited. "I didn't expect it to feel like the right place," she said. Not sentimentally, just plainly. The way she said things that were true and that she'd verified to her own satisfaction before saying them. The stove ticked. The wind continued its opinions outside. "Is it?" he said. "Still?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. It was the most direct thing she'd said in that particular register, and he held it carefully because that was what you did with things Helena offered directly. You didn't rush at them or make them into more than they were. You just received them and gave them the weight they deserved. "Good," he said. They went back to their respective evenings. But something had shifted and settled, the way the land itself shifted and settled after a hard freeze, quietly, permanently, into a new configuration. Spring came in March in a Wyoming way, which meant badly and inconsistently and with several false starts that were almost cruel in their optimism before the real warmth finally arrived in April and made itself credible. The South pasture, rested through the entire fall and winter, came up in April with grass so dense, and even that Walt Gruber rode over specifically to look at it and stood at the fence line for a while without saying much, which was his version of a long speech. "Helena's idea," Ethan said. "I know," Walt said. "That's why I'm not saying anything to you about it." 2 of the heifers calved in late April. Healthy calves, both of them, which Ethan knew was not guaranteed and had not allowed himself to count on, and was grateful for with a quietness that went deep. Helena was there for both, because she was there for everything on this land now, and she understood the calving process well enough to assist without being asked what she was doing. They added the calves to the ledger. The ledger that spring was a different document from the one Ethan had shown Helena the first night she arrived. It was the same physical book, his father's account ledger, but it had her handwriting through every section now, reorganized and annotated and cross-referenced with her own leather ledger. The two systems merged into something that was neither purely hers nor purely his, but worked better than either had separately. By June, they had 14 cattle on rested pasture, with calving ongoing, and the east well producing reliably through the driest weeks, and the new barn holding sound through the spring weather, and a vegetable garden behind the cabin that Helena had planted in March, with a practicality that Ethan appreciated, and a knowledge of soil conditions that he suspected came from those 3 summers in Ohio, and the uncle whose farm had taught her more than roofing. He rode out to the north pasture one morning in June alone, just to look at it. The land that Crowley had wanted badly enough to spend 2 years dismantling a man's livelihood to get. It was good land. He'd always known that. His father had chosen it for specific reasons. But standing in it now, he tried to see what Crowley had seen, the railroad route, the value that would multiply when the survey was public. The route had been announced in May. The Laramie newspaper had carried it on the front page. Land along the route was already changing hands at prices that made the original values look like errors. Ethan's north pasture was on the route. The value of what he was standing in had tripled in the months since Helena had sat at his table and asked about Crowley's specific interest in this particular piece of ground. He stood in the north pasture for a while and thought about all of it, the whole shape of the thing, from the platform at Bitter Ridge to this morning in June, with the grass coming in strong, and the calves in the south pasture, and the sound of Helena doing something in the barn that involved a hammer and a considered approach to whatever needed fixing. He thought about what he'd asked for when he'd written to the Bureau. Someone to help with the chickens. Someone to handle the domestic side so he could focus on the land. The specific smallness of that expectation and what had arrived instead. There was something worth understanding in that, he thought. Not a lesson exactly. Ethan distrusted the word lesson the way he distrusted things that were too clean to be true, but an observation. That a person's desperation could accidentally produce a better outcome than their planning would have, if they'd been honest about the desperation and lucky about who showed up. And that the showing up was not the end of it, that what came after the showing up was everything, and that everything included the mornings when they disagreed about the south pasture rotation, and the evenings that passed in comfortable silence, and the moment she'd stood in the open yard with the rifle loose at her side and looked up the hill at a man who'd tried to erase them both. He rode back to the homestead. Helena was coming out of the barn when he came through the gate, wiping her hands on a cloth, and she looked at him with the question she usually asked with her eyes rather than her voice, which was, "Anything wrong?" He shook his head. "North pasture looks good," he said. She nodded, looking at him with the clear, steady attention that he had come to think of simply as Helena looking at him, which was different from how anyone else looked at him in a way he didn't need to articulate. "The calves need moving to the north section next week," she said. "The south is getting heavy." "I know. I know you know." A pause. "I'm still going to say it." "I know that too," he said. She almost smiled. It had taken him a while to learn the geography of that expression, the particular arrangement of her mouth and eyes that meant something was quietly amusing to her without requiring demonstration. He'd learned it. He knew it now. He climbed down from the horse and led it toward the barn, and Helena fell into step beside him, and they walked across the yard of the homestead that was no longer failing, that was not yet thriving in any dramatic sense, but was solid and working and heading in a direction that felt true, and neither of them said anything for a minute. Then Helena said, "The chickens need water." "I'll get it," he said. "I already got it," she said. "Then why did you say they needed it?" "I was making conversation," she said. He looked at her. She looked straight ahead at the barn with the expression that was almost a smile but didn't quite commit to it. He laughed. It came out real, the kind that wasn't planned, and it felt like something that had been stored up for a while finding its way out. Helena glanced at him sideways, and the almost smile became something slightly more than almost. "The ledger shows a profit margin for the year," she said after a moment. "Small, but present." "Present's enough," he said. "For now," she agreed. "Next year should be better." "Should be." They put the horse up and they came out of the barn and stood for a moment in the June morning on the land that was theirs, in a way it hadn't fully been when she'd arrived, not because the deed had changed, but because two people had worked it together long enough that it carried both of them in it. Now, the knowledge of both their hands and decisions and arguments and the particular solutions that came from neither of them alone. The north pasture sat in the morning sun, worth 3 times what it had been, not for sale at any price. The chickens moved around the yard with their chickens' cheerful indifference to the entirety of what had happened, and Helena watched them for a moment with an expression that was fond in the understated way. She was fond of things she wouldn't say out loud. Ethan watched her watch them. There was still a lot of work to do. There always was, on land like this, in a place like this, in a life that had chosen difficulty over ease because difficulty was what the land offered, and ease had never been the point. The barn was new, but the rest of the buildings needed attention. The cattle numbers were recovering but not recovered. The legal proceedings in Cheyenne would drag into next year, probably longer, and the 7 ranchers whose stories had been tangled into Crowley's scheme would find their way toward some version of justice that would be incomplete and late and would have to be enough because it was what was available. The world didn't resolve cleanly. Ethan had known that before Helena arrived and knew it better now. But he also knew this, that on a morning in June on a Wyoming homestead that 2 months of desperate decision-making had almost destroyed, and 67 days of careful, relentless work had pulled back from the edge. The ledger showed a small profit, the calves were healthy, the well was full, and the woman who had stepped off the train with a leather ledger and a surveyor's gaze and absolutely no intention of tending. Only the chickens was standing in the yard beside him in the morning sun, planning next year's rotation. It was not a triumph. It was not a fairy tale. It was a working homestead with a repaired roof and a new barn and a south pasture that was going to be magnificent by August, run by 2 people who had learned each other's limits and exceeded each other's expectations and were not finished learning either one. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was the whole thing.